Oh, there are so many yummy vegetarian options out there. You could try like lentil soup, veggie burgers, tofu stir fry. The possibilities are endless.
Welcome. Today, we're diving into a really critical tax strategy, specifically for Canadian entrepreneurs who are getting ready for an initial public offering, an IPO. Taking a company from private to public is a massive achievement, but it also creates a very unique and pretty significant tax problem that, well, it requires some very careful planning ahead of time.
All right, so let's get right into it. We'll start with a scenario that I see all the time. You have a successful founder, someone who has poured years into building their private company from scratch. The next logical move to get the capital they need to grow is to go public. But that very marker of success, the IPO itself, creates a really tough tax dilemma. Now, at the very heart of this problem is something called the Lifetime Capital Gains Exemption, or the LCGE. You really have to think of this as a cornerstone of Canadian tax policy. It's specifically designed to reward the incredible risk and effort that goes into building a small business. It does this by offering a huge tax break when the shares of that business are sold. And to really get a sense of how important this is, just look at this scale. For 2025, the exemption amount is getting close to $1 million. That means an entrepreneur could potentially earn almost $1 million in capital gains completely tax-free. It is, without a doubt, one of the most powerful tools for wealth creation in our entire tax system.
Okay, so it's a huge benefit. But, as you would expect, you can't just get it automatically. The rules for eligibility are very strict. And for our discussion today, the most critical condition, the one that everything else hinges on, is that the company has to be what's called a Canadian-controlled private corporation, or a CCPC, at the exact moment the shares are sold.
And that CCPC requirement, well, that leads us right to the heart of the problem an IPO creates. The whole issue really boils down to what we call a control test, and how going public completely flips the result of that test. You see, the act of going public, listing your shares on a stock exchange where anyone in the world can buy them, it fundamentally transforms the company's legal and tax identity. It stops being a private company where control is held by a small, identifiable group, and it becomes a public corporation owned by thousands of shareholders all over the place. Now, this slide here, it just lays out the paradox perfectly. Before the IPO, the company is a CCPC. It meets the control test. And so the founder's shares are absolutely eligible for that huge exemption. But the very instant the IPO is complete, the company is no longer a CCPC. It's now a public corporation, it fails the control test, and that eligibility for the LCGE, it just vanishes, gone.
So this presents a really critical question for any founder, doesn't it? Is the price of going public, of getting that capital to grow, that you have to give up one of the country's biggest tax benefits for entrepreneurs? Do you really have to choose between the growth of your company and a personal tax advantage you've worked so hard to earn? Well, thankfully, the story doesn't end there. Canada's tax law actually anticipates this exact problem, and it provides a really elegant and strategic solution. There's a way to preserve this exemption, a pathway that lets founders lock in the tax benefit from their private company days before they step into the public markets.
Deep inside the Income Tax Act, there's a provision that allows a shareholder to make a special choice, or an election. And the timing here is absolutely critical. The election triggers what we call a deemed sale of their shares immediately before the IPO, at the last possible moment that the company still qualifies as a CCPC. Now, this mechanism is called a deemed disposition. It's basically a legal fiction, a what-if scenario for tax purposes. No shares are actually sold or change hands. Instead, the tax system agrees to treat the founder as if they sold their shares for their fair market value and then immediately bought them back at that exact same price. It's a way of creating a taxable event on paper by choice. This whole process has a really great name. It's known as crystallization. You're essentially freezing or crystallizing the capital gain that's built up over the years and then claiming the exemption against it. So let's move away from the theory and walk through a practical example to see exactly how this works. Okay, so here's the playbook, step by step. First, the founder elects to have that deemed sale at the share's current fair market value. Second, doing this triggers the capital gain on paper, all while the shares are still eligible for the LCGE.
Third, they apply their exemption to that gain, which brings the tax payable down to zero. And finally, and this is the real prize, the shares are now treated as if they were bought back at that high value, which creates a new, much higher cost base for the future.
So let's imagine our founder. Let's say her original investment, her cost to start the company, was $100,000. We call this the adjusted cost base, or ACB. After years of hard work right before the IPO, those shares are now worth $930,000. That means she's sitting on an unrealized capital gain of $830,000. So she makes that pre-IPO election. On paper, she's deemed to have sold the shares for $930,000. This crystallizes that $830,000 gain, which she then completely shelters with her LCGE. The result? Her taxable capital gain is zero. But the most important number on this slide is the last one. Her new adjusted cost base for those shares is now reset to $930,000. And this slide really shows you the power of that move. The tax cost of her shares has been stepped up from her original $100,000 all the way to $930,000. She's effectively banked that tax-free gain by building it right into the cost of her shares for any future calculations. Now let's fast forward a bit. The IPO was a success, and a few years later, she actually sells her shares for $1.5 million. Because her cost base is now that much higher, $930,000, her taxable capital gain is only $570,000. Now compare that to the alternative. Without the selection, her gain would have been a staggering $1.4 million. The tax savings are just enormous. Now, it's really crucial to understand something here. This mechanism is not some kind of loophole or a clever trick. It is a feature that was deliberately designed into our tax system to encourage and to reward the very act of entrepreneurship and the growth of Canadian companies. And you don't have to just take my word for it. Tax experts like John McElroy have analyzed this, and he confirms that this is an explicit pro-growth policy. He calls it, quote, one of the best tax benefits on the books, which really highlights its intended purpose, to fuel wealth creation and innovation right here in the Canadian economy. So let's just pull this all together. The main thing to take away from this is that with proper planning, an entrepreneur doesn't have to choose between taking their company public and using their lifetime capital gains exemption. This strategic election makes it absolutely possible to do both. And this all leaves us with a final, much bigger thought. You know, this specific rule is a powerful tool for one person, but it really points to a larger question. What role does strategic and targeted tax policy play in building a vibrant ecosystem for entrepreneurs, in incentivizing risk-taking, and ultimately in fueling a nation's entire innovation economy?